Welcome back to American Civil War Facts. Today, the First Railroad War. During the American Civil War, railroads emerged as a crucial component of military strategy. However, the Confederate States faced significant challenges in utilizing their rail network effectively. At the outset of the war, the majority of the South's rail lines were fairly new, having been built in the 1850s. But this was just about the only advantage the Confederacy had over their northern brethren. While their tracks were new, the Confederacy only had approximately 9,500 miles of railroad lines compared to the Union's 22,000 miles. Also, most of the South's railroads were primarily short lines, often less than 100 miles long, designed to transport cotton to ports, rather than support a war on the scale that they would need. Yet another disadvantage for the South was the lack of direct lines linking Eastern and Western theaters. The major east-to-west railroad that the Confederates relied on during the conflict was the Western and Atlantic. This crucial rail line ran from Atlanta, Georgia to Chattanooga, then Knoxville, Tennessee. It continued northeast through Lynchburg, Petersburg, and finally Norfolk, Virginia. The Western and Atlantic also connected with other key railroads, like the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, which provided a vital link between the Mississippi River and the Atlantic coast. Union forces recognized its importance and targeted it frequently, disrupting Confederate logistics and weakening their war effort. And when Chattanooga fell to Union forces in September of 1863, the Confederates lost the use of it permanently. This lack of direct rail linkage made transferring forces from the Western to Eastern theaters, or vice versa, extremely time-consuming. For example, in September 1863, it took 10 days to move Longstreet's corps of 12,000 men from Virginia to Georgia to reinforce Braxton Bragg's army. This lengthy travel time was a direct result of the deficiencies of the South's inefficient rail system and other logistical challenges. One of those challenges was the lack of standardization. Southern railroads had varying gauges, meaning the width of the tracks differed by as much as half a foot. Sometimes the gauge changed between states. For example, North Carolina and Virginia used standard gauge, but the rest of the Confederate rail system operated on broader gauges. So, when a line changed gauge, cargo and troops were forced to be transferred manually between trains, causing delays and inefficiencies. This disconnect kept much of the South isolated, which made it difficult to transport food, men, and weapons from their source to the front. Unlike the North, Southern railroad companies remained under civilian control, and each ran their own lines in separate depots, often on opposite sides of a city. As a result, cargo had to be offloaded on one end of town and transported by wagon across town to the other line to continue its journey, adding yet more delays. As the war progressed, resource shortages further crippled the Confederate railroads. The Union blockade prevented the import of iron, leading to worn-out locomotives and tracks. By 1863, a quarter of the South's locomotives required repairs. That fact, along with the deterioration of railroad ties, meant train speeds had dropped significantly from 25 miles per hour to just 10. And since most of the experienced rail workers had been drafted into the Army, there were few workers left to repair what little the South had in the way of locomotives and track, or to build new track. During the war, the South only managed to build 400 miles of new track. The North built 4,000 miles of new rail lines and built 800 new locomotives. The South built none. They resorted to repairing what they had or using captured Union locomotives. Early in the war, when the military needed to transport supplies via railroads, the War Department or Army commanders would arrange contracts with private companies, with military supplies traveling with commercial goods. This could cause unexpected delays, especially during war or emergencies. The South could do little during the war to correct this, as their government was deliberately weaker than state governments and had to rely on the goodwill of the railroad executives and state governors. The North had the same issue, but quickly solved this problem. In April 1861, President Lincoln took control of all northern railroads to prioritize military transport and support the war effort. Then, in February 1862, Congress passed a law giving the president authority to seize any railroad or telegraph lines deemed necessary for public safety. This power included taking control of all equipment, rolling stock, locomotives, and track, and placing the operation of the railroads under a military command called the United States Military Railroad. The USMR was under the command of General Daniel C. McCallum, former general manager of the Erie Railway, and General Herman Haupt, former chief engineer of the Pennsylvania Railroad. These expert railroaders were incredibly effective at putting together a skilled workforce to maintain, repair, build, as well as destroy rail lines. The two men were also adept at preventing egotistical field officers from interrupting operations through meddling or making special requests. In contrast, the Confederate government was slow to take control of the railroads, leaving them in the hands of private companies who prioritized moving goods and paying customers over the needs of the military. These railroad issues severely impacted the Confederate war effort. The inability to move troops and supplies ultimately limited the South's military options and affected campaigns and contributed to logistical failures, ultimately affecting the Confederacy's ability to sustain the war. In conclusion, the Confederate railroads, plagued by lack of standardization, resource shortages, and operational inefficiencies, played a significant role in the South's eventual defeat. In contrast, the Union's superior railroad management and infrastructure were pivotal to their victory. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more insights into the logistics and strategies of the Civil War.